afternoon, everybody. Oh, yep. Good afternoon, everybody. Could I please call everyone to a seating position, please, so we can commence. VC Executive, there's the front row up here. Glenn, Sean, John. Come on, don't make me call you out. I know. AV right? Yep, excellent. Good afternoon. I would like to welcome, that's very loud. I would like to welcome you to the University of Southern Queensland panel discussion on the Voice to Parliament. As little as just over an hour ago, we had the Prime Minister of Australia announce that the date for the referendum would be on the 14th of October. My name is Professor Odette Best and I am the Pro Vice-Chancellor, First Nations Education and Research here at the University. I am a Goreng Goreng, a Bonthamora and Kummamberi Yugambeh woman, which means I have intimate ties to Woorabinda Mission, the Gold Coast, Stradbroke Island and the Channel Country way out west in Queensland. I will be your panel moderator for today. The University of Southern Queensland acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands and also the waterways where the university campuses are located. Further, we acknowledge the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and pay our deepest respect to elders past and present. Further, I personally would like to acknowledge all First Nations peoples who are joining us today in this room and virtually online, including my niece, who is a very proud UniSQ student doing nursing. I also would like to thank everyone else here today and also acknowledge the over 250 people watching via live stream. The questions that are being asked to the panel today are the questions we received from you, the audience. We thank you for providing your questions that everyone submitted online. However, due to the high volume, we cannot guarantee that we will be able to answer all of them. We will do our best to address as many as possible, but some may unfortunately go unanswered. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you our panel members for today. Unfortunately, the member for Bundamba, Lance McCallum, was called away on parliamentary business and is now unable to join our panel discussion. However, what a team we have lined up. I first of all would like to introduce Professor Bronwyn Fredericks, who is a Murray woman from southeast Queensland and boasts an exceptional 30-year track record within the tertiary sector, both state and federal governments, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-based organisations. Becoming Pro Vice-Chancellor Indigenous Engagement at the University of Queensland in 2018, Professor Fredericks advanced to Deputy Vice-Chancellor Indigenous Engagement in 2023. Professor Fredericks was the recipient of the inaugural National NAIDOC Award in Education in 2022 in recognition for her outstanding and many years of service and hard work in education. Elevating Indigenous education, Professor Bronwyn Fredericks has orchestrated key initiatives across the University of Queensland and Central Queensland University, including things as their reconciliation plans and other key initiatives. In 2017, she became a Queensland Productivity Commission Commissioner. She oversees inquiries into Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community services, imprisonment and also manufacturing. Thank you for attending today, Bron. I would also now like to introduce to you Alira Davis. Alira Davis is a Cobble woman from the Barringum and Birrigubba nations. She was born in Logan, Queensland and grew up in Beenleigh. Alira completed her diploma in government, specialising in project management, and has worked in public service, specifically in the Attorney General's Department in Human Resources, Emergency Management and Business Operations, where she has worked closely on policies, grants and managing programs. Alira has worked closely with Bridget Karma in leading and co-convening the Uluru Youth Dialogues, organising and co-chairing the Uluru Youth Summit in 2019, and providing First Nations youth with the skills and knowledge to make substantive change to the lives of our people and for a better future for all of us. Thank you, Alira. I would now like to introduce Professor Simon Young. Simon Young is a professor in the UniSQ School of Law and Justice and Centre for Heritage and Culture. He started life as a big firm lawyer before moving into research and teaching, particularly around First Nations issues and government law. He has worked in that space for 25 years in Queensland and also Western Australia. He now focuses particularly on native title and water law reform, on graduating strong First Nations lawyers and more culturally safe, aware, non-Indigenous lawyers. He also is making more spaces for the voices of First Australians in law and also education. Thank you, Simon. And last, but certainly not least, Emerson Zarafa Payne is a Jitterbal man and is a lecturer in the College for First Nations at the University of Southern Queensland and is the acting First Nations officer of the Queensland Teachers Union. Having been in the education space for over a decade as a secondary teacher, he is now a lecturer, researcher and activist. His research interests are educational policy and social justice and making change from the top down. Having taught in large, low socio-economic state schools for the entirety of his teaching career before moving into academia, he holds a Bachelor of Secondary Education, Master of Education and a Grad Cert of Policy. He is due to submit his PhD next year. He is currently doing his PhD through University of Queensland, and I am proud to say I'm one of his supervisors. Thank you so much, Emerson, for coming. How the panel will work today is that we have a list of questions that have been compiled from all of the questions that have been asked or sent in when you registered online, and there were hundreds and hundreds of questions. So it's been a way of trying to whittle them down. We only have an hour for the panel this afternoon, so we have chosen 3 questions, and if time permits, I will go to the backlog of questions that we aren't going to answer today. Before we do commence, there is just one other thing that I would like to say. I would like to acknowledge the Vice-Chancellor Executive, who I made sit in the front row. I would like to acknowledge, though, the Vice-Chancellor, Geraldine McKenzie. Professor McKenzie is unable to join us here in person today, but is watching us online. Provost Professor Karen Nelson, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic Affairs, Professor Glenn Coleman, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research and Innovation, Professor John Bell, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Enterprise Services, Mr Michael Thomas, Pro-Vice-Chancellor Engagement, Mr Sean Walker, and Chief Financial Officer, Mr Cliff Kay. Thank you for attending today. So, shall we get a start? Make a crack. Let's go. Okay. The first lot of questions that I will be asking today will be addressed to Simon. Simon, one of the questions, the first questions that I looked at and I thought, ooh, that would be a great one to ask Simon. Simon, why does the voice to Parliament need to be included in the Constitution, and what would it look like in legal terms?
Great, thanks Odette. Happy. I might start with the second part of that first, might make good sense. I guess in a nutshell, in its essence, what we're dealing with here is it's a long-term investment in an idea that we know works. We know it works. We know that partnering with communities at a grassroots level, collaboratively, early, genuinely, we've got lots of examples of that working. So we're making a commitment to that idea, sort of putting our money where our mouth is, I guess, and then over time, we'll work together to build on that idea. That's the constitutional bit. So government will have a chance to see how it works most efficiently for it, and we can revise and trial and error. Communities will have a chance to figure out how they can be best represented and heard, and we'll trial and error and work out that. And the legislation that will follow the referendum can incrementally reflect that and build on it, if you like. And at the end of the day, what really emerges is a shared responsibility. It's a shared responsibility. We'll make some mistakes, but we'll make them together, and then we'll fix them together. And that's really the big turn in the road. We've got lots of ideas in terms of what this might look like. We've got some very clear aspirational guidelines that are very strong about its representative and accountable nature. As I said, we've got local examples, and we've got overseas examples that we can draw from as well. And what all those examples tell us is that this idea works because usually the solutions and the answers are already there at community level, but the community leaders just have no guaranteed way to be heard genuinely and consistently. And then in terms of the Constitution, Odette, well, that's whack my lawyer hat on there, but there's probably three quick things we need to remind ourselves there. The first is the relative permanence of the idea. The Constitution is, anything that's in our Constitution is relatively permanent. And that's not something we need to be scared of. There's really good reasons for that in this context. The first is lots of years of experience in law and government tells us that the way we get good independent advice is having some degree of protection and permanence to the body we're asking the question to. The last thing we want to do is spend all our time and money building a body that has to tiptoe through the politics, because we're not going to get frank answers. We're not going to get good answers. But just as importantly, I think we've had lots of structures in this space put up and torn down over the years, several in my lifetime. And I'm not too sure we can keep asking First Nations communities to invest their precious resources and time and energy and the intellectual and emotional energy of the elders, which is so important across Australia. We can't keep asking them to invest in an idea when we're not prepared to commit to it ourselves. It's also superior law, Odette, so it can't be brushed aside for convenience, like the Racial Discrimination Act is periodically.
Absolutely.
And then just as importantly, the federal dimension is really important. That's missing from the debate when I listen very closely. Not only because these are national challenges that we need national answers to, but also because we've got to remember that ever since 1967, the referendum, the federal government has paramount power over Indigenous affairs, paramount over the states. So while the initiatives at state level are all good and well, it's really important that we get good structures in place at federal level, because that's where the buck stops ultimately in this area. Good lawmaking and policy making structures. So that's really important as well.
Thank you, Simon. I'd now like to throw the next question over to Professor Bronwyn Fredericks. Bronwyn, do you think the Voice proposal will provide access for community members across regional and remote communities in Australia to have equitable contributions in the decision making?
Well,
Hang on, are you on? Sounds a bit
I
tougher.
think I'm live now. Am I live?
No. AV's just coming. AV's coming now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Lift
Thank
off.
you.
Just commencing for me, just because I'm speaking out here, is to acknowledge country that I'm on today, and I've come across from somewhere else today. Having said that, this country here is very well known to me. Some of you would know me as being introduced as Professor Fredericks, but I actually, as a teenager, would get my backside kicked sometimes from Mr. Davis, who owned part of this land out here, for cutting down barbed wire fences with my brother and my siblings and all the people in the neighbourhood, trying to capture brumbies for us to ride. So, and then many years walking through this country here. So I do acknowledge it, that I'm back on it and formally speaking today. Some of the roads that are named around here actually named after some of my family members, particularly at Redbank Plains in terms of my non-Indigenous family as well. So in terms of communities being vocal, they are now. We can hear that now. We also have seen that as part of processes. We've seen that you can look at all the minutes and all the documentation from the last 12 years of this process around recognition, since it was first formally tabled by John Howard, former Prime Minister, and then all through the subsequent processes. And there has been at least 7 formal processes, plus all the meetings, all the minutes, all the briefings, all the roundtables, let alone the regional dialogues. The regional dialogues had representation from people who were nominated to attend from a regional context. They weren't just randoms, they weren't just people in one community, they were regional dialogues where people were nominated to attend those meetings. I'll also say that I knew the South East Queensland Regional Dialogue was on. I did not want to go. I did not need to go. In fact, members of my family and the extended family and community said, you know, maybe if it was an educational public health, I should be going. But it wasn't. It wasn't specific to areas for which I had knowledge, and it wasn't specific areas that I should be speaking on. So in that regard, at that time, I didn't need to go. I had to put my ego aside around that, and that's part of what we don't often talk about is people saying, I want to go, or well, I wasn't invited, or I wasn't consulted, or whatever. There's also an element of ego that people think they should be, when we know that the representation included traditional owners, included elders, included youth. So communities will have a say. The process to date demonstrates that. There is perhaps a question later where I can talk from the point of as a commissioner in terms of what I heard in that role as well, what communities wanted, and the voice is in part that too. Yeah.
Thank you, Bronwyn. I'd like to now take it over to Alira, please. Alira, what is the primary purpose of the Indigenous voice? Is it to provide advice, influence policy, or have decision-making powers?
And thank you for having me on this panel too. It's been a long year, but also very, I think, powerful and challenging at times. But obviously acknowledging that the PM announced the date today, so we've got a long 6 weeks ahead of us. But I thought I'd just read out the amendment that will go into the Constitution, because I think that gives an idea of what the voice will be like. And just noting too that, you know, we didn't, specifically in the regional dialogues and after the Uluru Statement was issued to the Australian people, we didn't want to go with a permanent model that will be into the Constitution. As we know, it's very hard to change the Constitution with going to a referendum. But we wanted to make sure that, you know, we know that one size doesn't fit all and all communities aren't the same. So making sure that we have these discussions after the voice is enshrined is really key, especially with the consultation process with our Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander communities. As Bronwyn said, some people weren't involved. However, it's a continuous consultation process afterwards as well, making sure that we know what the voice model will look like. So I'm just going to read out the amendment. So in Chapter 29, 129, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander voice, in recognition of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia, subsection 1, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Voice. Subsection 2, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to the Parliament and the executive government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples. And subsection 3, the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Voice, including its compositions, functions, powers and procedures. Now, from the referendum group, they made these design principles that what would the voice model would look like. And that emphasises the fact that the voice will make representations will be chosen by Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people based on the wishes of local communities. So as I said, emphasising on the continuous consultation process after that. And the voice will make representative of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander communities, gender balance and include youth. So just noting that it will be a continuous consultation process and it will be a body who would advise government on the laws and policies that affect us in our communities.
Thank you, Alira. Now I'd like to throw it over to Emerson, please. Emerson, does it matter that a voice comes before treaty?
Now, I'm going to...
I don't think you're on either. Is he?
Can I use yours?
Can hear him up the back? Okay.
Back to this. Okay. I'm going to answer this question in a few different parts, but I just want to start off by defining what a treaty is. So a treaty is essentially an agreement between two parties. So when we're talking about it in this context, it would be usually between the government and First Nations peoples. Treaty is parliamentary. It's at a parliamentary level, not a constitutional level, like Simon was talking about earlier. And what that means is if we were to get a treaty in place and another political party got into power, they could override that treaty and they could get rid of that treaty. So whilst treaty, may be part of the journey, we talk about voice, treaty, truth, we need to remember that it's important to have a voice first because a voice is a constitutional group. And I don't personally, me speaking personally, I don't understand how you can have a treaty without a voice. Who are you going to listen to? Who are you going to take advice from in order to create this treaty. In saying that as well, every single state except New South Wales is also on the path to treaty. The Victorian government actually, in their documentation surrounding treaty, they call treaty First Nations Victorians having a voice. So, there's already that comparison there as well. Yeah, that's why it's important to have voice before treaty.
Thank you, Emerson. Now I'd like to hand it back over to Bronwyn with another question, and I think this one lends itself very nicely to being a productivity commissioner. So, Bronwyn, we have heard a ridiculous amount of doom and gloom about what, in all reality, is a relatively minor change to the Constitution and will have the same powers, if not less, than the Productivity Commission or other government consultative bodies. To what extent do you feel political engagement will increase in Indigenous communities as a result of such a minor constitutional change?
I think we have to separate what is actually political engagement or political process for a start. But we also have to think we have had Close the Gap for over a decade. We have not made substantial gains. That is fact. Look it up. Whether it's the state we live in, or whether it is on the national agenda, we are not making gains. And in some areas, some of the key performance areas, we have gone backwards. Right? And that is just not good enough. It is nowhere near good enough. Without some forms of change and structural change, we are going to sit in the status quo. Non-Indigenous and Indigenous people are going to continue to do the dance together that we do every year around closing the gap targets, the lack of performance, key indicators. The university will have its own regarding the close the gap that's aligned in terms of access and equity and participation of Indigenous people. Health will have their own, childhood, aged care, all of those things. Communities, when I was undertaking the remote and discrete community inquiry, were very, very clear that they want a say in what happens in their communities, around their communities, but also in their regions. They want their reports beyond compliance reports, which is what's collected. How many beds are occupied in maybe a domestic violence emergency housing? How many people are seen for an STD or an ear infection? They want reports on a whole range of things beyond just compliance data. They want analysis of those reports. That material often is not provided. It's also not transparent in terms of where the money goes. All of us here, every single person here would have had an example or seen an example where money has been allocated not based on need, but based on marginal seats coming up to the next state or federal election. We want transparency around that with Indigenous funding as well. So part of this is about the voices. There is a case study in one of my reports to the Commission in regards to the community of Cowan. So it's in a public document. 400 people, 70 service providers, but no mechanism for consultative mechanism about what the service providers do, how they do their work, and no forms of data and reporting back to that community. They just tick the boxes of the compliance reports and it goes off and they don't get that material back and they're not engaged in the process. That's just one, let alone all the other communities that I worked with in this state. But repeatedly they said this would make it better. We have already had NACCHO, the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, come out and say how this change would assist a greater mechanism to advise government on laws and policy. NACCHO and the Coalition of Peaks, they are service providers. They're contractors. Would you want contractors representing you? Would you tolerate that as a representative body for your every need? No. Why shouldn't we? Why should we either? We deserve better.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Alira, how will the voice representative be decided? Is this going to be voted by the public or chosen by politicians?
So people assume or have seen misinformation out there that the voice will be a Canberra voice. That is not true. There will no be, and also people say that the Indigenous elite will be that voice. As I read out before, I read some of the design principles, and the voice will be chosen by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander local communities based on their wishes. So similar to what we did with the regional dialogues, And I say we because I did attend the Brisbane Regional Dialogue, and it's our largest consultation process that we've had with First Nations people. It's not just government going into communities and telling you how it is. They actually, had robust discussions there. So ensuring that people and community leaders picking their representatives. You're recognised as an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander person, and you're picked as a community member because you've done the hard yards, you've done the work. We need to give the voice back to the voiceless, and the voices are on the ground, and communities are the experts. I just want to also mention on to another point as well that if the voice is enshrined into the Constitution, it's protected, permanent, and legitimate. So Parliament and politicians they have to listen to us. And as Simon alluded to before, we've had bodies that have been legislative and have been taken out and abolished by a flick of a pen, so by the next Prime Minister. So if the voice is in the Constitution, in our guiding document that we listen to, Parliament must listen to us. So ensuring that it's not going to be a top to bottom approach, it's going to be a bottom up approach. And I've, spent my last, 4 years on this as a young person, and I've trusted our leaders in this to ensure that they stand by the mandate of the Uluru Statement from the Heart and what the mob wanted within those regional dialogues and those delegates. So if you just putting out there, if you go onto our website, ulurustatement.org, we do have the design principles on there that will hold, the voice model process accountable, and that's what we need. We need accountable and transparency within our communities. We want to make sure that we have a seat at the table. We're sick of taking baby steps, and as Emerson alluded to, treaties aren't going to do that. Treaty is in the reform. It's not that we're saying we don't want treaty. We need a voice first, and we need a voice and a seat at the table.
Thank you, Alira. I'm going to throw it now back over to Simon, please. So Simon, campaigners against the voice have argued that it will create a near universal grounds for judicial review. Campaigners for the voice say this is not the case and is purely advisory. Who is right, why, and how can we be sure?
Thanks, Odette. That's a nice, chewy legal question, but one I'm happy
I thought so. Hold your mic up.
Nice, chewy legal question, one I'm happy to take a swing at. I better just warn you that I've just finished teaching a 12-week course on judicial review of government action, so much to my students' dismay, but you might have to throw something at me to shut me up.
Sure.
So.
Water?
But yeah, perfect. Look, I think at the bottom, in essence, what's going on is we're mixing things up. We're getting ahead of ourselves. It's a cart before the horse thing here, in the sense that we're arguing about the upholstery on the cart before we've even bought the horse. The constitutional change is a very simple principle. It's a very simple, sturdy principle. It's a right to speak. It's advisory only, nothing more. And the Constitution actually says that, the constitutional change, that Alira said, the Parliament will make laws in the future about the composition, function, structures, powers, etc. So that's all discussions we can have that will be put in place by our lawmakers after appropriate consultation. So it's advisory only. The best guard against litigation, in my experience for ageing grey government lawyer, is clear and simple words, and these are very clear and simple words. It couldn't be simpler and clearer in terms of there's very little ambiguity there. The idea that the High Court might read something in and make something up, well, it never has in my lifetime. The High Court respects intention when it reads the Constitution, and it respects impact. It thinks about the impact. So really we've got this simple principle that will be enshrined, and then we build on top of that with legislation. So legislation will design the interface, and that's a conversation we'll have, and we'll nip and tuck it and refine it. And rest assured that these ideas aren't new to government law. The idea that decision makers might have advisory bodies to listen to and particular considerations to take into account for particular decisions. Government's incredibly comfortable with that. That's bread and butter for a couple of 100 years. That's how our government law has worked. So there's nothing new and nasty and surprising about that. No government officer would have any problem with this being part of their process. And the courts don't coerce. The courts won't use this mechanism to coerce executive government into decisions. They never have, and I can't imagine they'd begin now. There's no reason to anticipate that. the reach is about right, I think, Odette, in terms of there's been a bit of debate about the wording that Alira read out, power to make representations on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs. Well, for me, that's about spot on, to be honest. And there's a real risk in trying to confine it more, because Odette or Bronwyn may well see in a proposed law a risk to community that I won't see, for all my years. And I want to hear that. I want to hear what they have to say before it's too late. So we don't want to be too confining. We've got to let the voice discover and decide what's important for it to speak about. So there's nothing to be scared about there either. Definitely has to extend to the executive government. That's another debate. Executive lawyer, been there for way too long, longer than it's good for my health, but it sure has to extend to the executive. That's where most of the policy's formed. That's where the day-to-day action is. And think about the time lag if this voice only spoke to Parliament. Parliament acts over many years making laws. The voice is lost in the mix long before it could have served any real purpose. And at the end of the day too, I'd just remind everybody in this sphere of litigation that we've got a court for a reason. We've got courts for a reason. It's just a referee. That's how our system works. We've got court decisions on everything from headache tablets to product packaging to dangerous dogs, all the way to the High Court. I think we can spare a decision or two if we need it to help us understand the greatest challenge in our generation, the greatest national challenge. We can spare it. It's just going to the referee, and then we'll all get on with it, and we'll understand it a little bit better. But my personal view, Odette, is that this structure will reduce litigation. Getting good law and policy right the first time is how you reduce dispute. That's sort of law 101 when our students first come in. And we know this idea works. There's no doubt about that. The evidence is in. We've just got to commit to it.
Thank you. Okay, next question I'm going to pass on to Emerson. Emerson, do you have any suggestions for addressing misunderstanding and also misinformation about the proposed voice in ways that are respectful and also inclusive?
I think the biggest thing for me would be inviting people to have that conversation. And I think I can say the same for the rest of the panellists that are up here with me. I don't have any friends or family that are voting no, but I'm very interested to meet with some no voters and yarn with them and just genuinely see their point of view and explain my point of view as well and have that conversation. And just, see what their reasoning is and also tell them, my life story and my reasons and why it's so important for me and my mob.
Thank you, Emerson. Could I have a timekeeper, please? What time are we? 5 past. So we've clearly got time for the next round of questions, the third lot of questions. So I'm going to throw it back over to Bronwyn, if that's okay. Bronwyn, one of our panel, our audience says or asks the questions, as an Aboriginal woman myself who will be voting yes, I would be interested to hear the panel's thoughts on how those of us voting yes can engage in open dialogue with other Indigenous people who are voting no.
With ones that are voting no. You got to find them first. Because we know that the majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, over 80%, are in fact voting yes. And it's interesting that the media and some of the mischief-making social media that goes on, I was trying to discount that in the poll, but they use the polls for everything else. And the government polls, there's been 3 different polls around it that all showed that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people overwhelmingly support the voice. And certainly I was in an event in Ipswich yesterday. There were elders there, community members there who are very clearly voting yes. And, I was up in Toowoomba Sunday, same thing. So people, as I move around, and it's not whether, I'm just in those circles, but I guess if you wanted to go and find out about bush food cookery or Latin dancing, you'd Google them and find where they are. I just would be the same as would be looking if I was looking at something around bush food cookery on Google or Latin dancing, that I would also think whether they're shonky websites or is this accurate material to be looking at, or this group reputable, or is it just made up of people that spread conspiracies not just about this but about everything else. There are people who are spreading lies and disinformation and misinformation. If you follow me on social media, you'll see sometimes I call it out and I will just say, you are spreading lies, disinformation and misinformation, and now you're blocked because that's what's happening. So some of that no's is based on people's genuine concern, I think, in terms of, you know, they're worried or they're adamant around treaty. But like once you have the conversation, once I've had the conversation with a couple of no's, and this is over like 2 years, and they understand that treaties, like in Queensland, could be overridden by the state. They're an act of parliament. They have to go through a process of parliament. They have to be agreed on in the parliament. You know, you've got to try and do that first. Then secondly, they can be overridden at any time by the state. And then our Queensland treaty can be overridden at any point based on whatever the federal parliament decides. So they are not this utopian dream that some people in the no camp think it is. And then the other option here is the status quo. So if you are on any of those sites around no, once you start to Google, maybe ask the group, what is your options? What is your solutions for the dance of close the gap and the dance of poverty and the dance of incarceration and the dance of discomfort between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people? It is ongoing reconciliation that we have had for 32 years now in this country. If it is truth-telling, that's what you want first. That's what they want first. We have had that as part of reconciliation for 32 years. If you haven't been doing that with part of reconciliation, what the heck have you been doing? So try and understand the reasons for no, but don't get sucked in around some falsehoods or mischief making that other people may have got sucked into. That's all I'll say. All right?
Thank you, Bronwyn.
Really look at the clear material, look at the good information, look at the reports that have come out that are documented by the lawyers, look at what the former High Court judges have said. You know, they can't all be wrong. They can't all be wrong.
Thank you, Bronwyn. I'd like to pass over to Alira, please. Alira, I would like you to tell the audience, because we did get one of the questions in from one of our online viewers, in trying to understand how the Voice is representing younger Indigenous people, given that you guys are actually the largest demographic of Indigenous population. We buck the trend when it comes to non-Indigenous and Indigenous people in this country. Our largest demographic is with our younger, unlike non-Indigenous folk where it's opposite. So what's it like for you and what's been going on and how has that happened?
Yeah, so I think also I just want to quickly mention something with when Bronwyn commented on, you know, the yes and no. I think also mentioning too, you don't always have to ask a First Nations person what they're going to vote.
Absolutely.
We've already had a traumatic history in this country, in our own country. You know, we're 3% of the population, but we need you fellas to walk with us now. We need you to help us push this movement for a better Australia. And as young people, you know, as a black young woman up here, it's hard at times, but, you know, my elders and ancestors have fought the good fight for so many years since William Cooper asked for a voice. So the concept of the voice isn't new either. We've been doing it since colonisation. And we're also trying to handle it within an era of social media as well, which is, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation. But, you know, our strongest supporters are our youngest supporters from age 18 to 35. So, and it's going to be our first referendum. I think it's if you're over 40 or just under 40, this is the first time you'll be voting maybe it's I don't know what the statistics are, but I think it's if you're over a certain age or 30, 35, this is your first referendum that you'll be voting in. So, it's really key to have young voices at the table and have that representation too. You know, I'm also up here on behalf of the Uluru Dialogues, but I also stand by that cultural mandate and that cultural authority. If my leadership says something that I need to do something, I'll do it. And still sticking by that and keeping that culture alive too within this process. But, you know, I think just making sure that you're always being informed and educated in this. One, not always asking a First Nations person what they think. to making sure that you're getting that factual information. The Voice isn't divisive. We've been divided country since colonisation. This is us bringing it together and walking together for one cause, for one goal, to make sure that our First Nations people have a rightful place in our country. And we're going to keep standing by that. And we're going to a referendum regardless. And if you want to, we want everyone to walk on that journey for our people to feel self-determined and powerful in their country.
Thank you, Alira. I'm going to throw it back to Simon now. Simon, do you think that there are any risks in terms of the power costs or perceived lack of detail in the proposal?
Thanks, Odette. Really important questions. Good for us to think about. Yeah, and it's something as a long government lawyer, I've held it up, I've shaken it, I've held it up to the light, and I see very little risk here. This is a very modest proposal in Western legal terms. It's a very good idea from the First Nations perspective because it's something organic that can rise to the needs and challenges as they emerge and change. But from a Western perspective, it's very modest. It's a very modest idea. It really just, as Bronwyn's been confirming, it really just supports and does better what our governments already are trying to do, what they've already committed to doing, what they've obligated to do, what their current priorities are. It's just a better way to do it. That's what we're committing to. It's certainly advisory only. I can't shake anything out of that proposal that's more than advisory. There's no power of veto, as the design principles make perfectly clear. There's no power to delay. There's no onerous new obligations on government. And at the end of the day, there's nothing to be scared of in having better informed law and policy. I'm very much with the same mind as the Solicitor General on this one, is that this can only enhance our system. I think we should aspire to have many voices to Parliament. It's just that this is a priority area that we know we particularly need. In terms of the detail, that's been a big argument, hasn't it?
Yes.
A perennial argument.
Yes.
Firstly, I'd say the detail is there, the possible detail. Design principles, Alira read out for us. We've also got the Langton-Calma report. Now, that was really a couple of the key spokespeople sort of trying the code on, really, saying, look, this is what it could look like. This is one possible model. And, it's very carefully thought through, and happy to share the details with anyone that's interested about a head body and then individual local regional bodies, maybe 35, for example, that design themselves and have a flow of communication and elect members to the upper body. It's really quite a sturdy model that they've suggested. But there's a really good reason why we shouldn't insist on firmer and further detail in what we're doing. Because we're voting on the principle, not the machinery. That's really important. Don't put the cart and the upholstery and the wheel colour before the horse. We've got to take this step by step. And there's good reasons why we don't need detail now. That's the whole Constitution. There's a few lawyers amongst you. In terms of law, that's a very slim read. That's a very easy read. That's our whole system in there. First Nations people are invisible in it, which is a great tragedy. But that's our whole system. Detail doesn't go in there, and that's because this document has to be as relevant to our kids and our kids' kids as it is to us, and it was in 1901. It was just drafted by grey-beard lawyers like me. There's nothing biblical about our Constitution. Every now and then it needs a phone patch. We can improve it. And the evidence is in that we need to improve it in this regard. So if we had a full plate of detail provided to us, that's actually misleading. Because that detail, if they'd come with a fully prefabricated structure, that's not going in the Constitution, so that could change in 6 months. So we shouldn't be telling people that they're voting on any particular detail. Calma Langton just give us a bit of an idea of what the code might look like, how it might work. And furthermore, as I thought more about this as this debate continues to re-emerge, the thing that really struck me was if we insist on detail and a prefabricated top-down approach, that's departing from the whole idea of the voice. How can we kick off this idea that's trying to get us to move away from top-down imposed solutions and bring the solutions from community? Kicking the whole idea off in exactly the opposite way is a pretty daft way to start the process, isn't it?
I want to add to that because how many people, just put your hands up, the ones in the room, not online, how many people have read the Constitution? Oh, there's a few here. Did you know that the words that relate to the national broadcaster, there are 5 words? Now, no one asked for detail about that.
Yeah.
It's been changed 3 times since 1932. When it was formulated around some form of judiciary requirement for the High Court, it took some time, a couple of years, in fact, to work the detail out for regards to how many people should be in the High Court, what the High Court should do, who would be members, all of those things. Read, if you haven't read it, look at the Constitution. It is based on principles. And, you know, from Aboriginal community's point of view here, you'd be overriding the consultation process and the voice that the community says they want. And I would have to ask all of you, if you want more detail for this process than any other constitutional process in this country, if you just want more for this process, because this process is about Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, it says more about you than it does about the Constitution or us. Just saying.
Absolutely.
You know that hashtag? Just saying.
That's it. And what we're really doing here is we're building, is that okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah, we're building a platform. I mean, that detail is as much for our kids and our kids' kids as it is for us. We don't need to force the shapes and colours into it now. That's their journey as much as it's our journey. We'll make some mistakes, but we'll make them together. And all of our kids will walk taller, non-Indigenous and Indigenous, for having that platform under them. And lastly, you know, in terms of cost, that's an easy one for me. This is an investment in an idea we know that works, and it's a tool of education and communication. And I think Obama said it best on this one. He said, if you think education's expensive, try the cost of ignorance. And that rings very true here for me. I think both political parties, if we had them here in honest mode, would admit that we have wasted a lot of time and money, as Bronwyn and as we've all been alluding to over the years in this space. So this is a better way to do it. The evidence is in that we know this works. We've just got to commit to it. It will pay for itself 10 times over, and it will endear itself to both sides of politics if it's given a chance. I'm pretty confident of that.
Thank you. Timekeeper, please. Okay. So I'm going to ask for, I've got one last question for Emerson, then I'm going to throw open a question to the floor of my own, if possible. Emerson, so as a young Indigenous man, with the announcement coming down barely 2 hours ago, where do you go from here in supporting the voice?
For me, does this work? For me, it's go time. Like, I want to get out, I want to talk to people, I want to activate people. I feel like the focus for me, again, personally, is not necessarily mob. As Bronwyn was saying before, recent statistics show that 87% of First Nations people actually support a voice to Parliament, but only 40% of non-Indigenous people believe that statistic. So because of the media and the way that the media has blown things out of proportion, I feel like the main, I guess, target or the people that I want to have conversations with are non-Indigenous peoples. So allies, even people who, you know, maybe they're not allies, I want to have those conversations because it is about walking together. It's walking together, and the Uluru Statement is an invitation. It's an invitation for non-Indigenous peoples as well. We need to all come together because it's going to result in a better future for everybody.
Thank you, Emerson. So I'm going to ask from each panel member just to give us one closing statement, if that's okay. So Bronwyn, in the session today, what would be your closing statement?
I want to follow up from what Emerson said, because I've done a few events in the last couple of days and groups that I would not normally talk to. And that's been the last few days intensively, but also over the last few months and quite some time, really. One of the things I like to pose to people is, what kind of ancestor you want to be? Because when I talk to some of the older people, particularly non-Indigenous people, when we talk about the 1967 referendum, pretty much it's easy to pick, sometimes, not always, but sometimes it is easy to pick those who voted yes versus those who voted no, because they evade the answer, they change the topic quickly, they are a bit worried about telling me they voted no, or their parents voted no. You know, their children, if they voted yes, they told their children and their grandchildren, their nieces and nephews, if they don't have children, that they voted yes. They're proud to have voted yes in 67. I want you to be proud to vote yes in this referendum. I want you to be the ancestors of the future that people are proud of, that changed this country for the better, that changed the dance between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to a combined dance. The reason I wear hearts every single day, and I have for nearly 4 years, is because of my belief in the Uluru Statement. After reading the material, talking to people, talking with my own family, my mum went and got a beautiful heart engraved on it that I wear sometimes too, you know, that they're all behind me. People gift me things at university for my office and home with hearts on it because they believe in it. This is a love letter to Australia. That's how Professor Megan Davis describes the Uluru Statement. It is a love letter saying we want peace. It is a love letter saying it is time for us all to move on. It is a love letter saying we are a good country. But you know what? We can be a great, bloody, super duper country. And we're missing out, all of us. Let's do it.
Thank you, Bron. Alira.
That's hard to follow.
And it was a bit unexpected, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I think just noting that you are voting on the principle, not the detail. You know, do you believe Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should have a voice within their communities? It's very simple. And also that, you know, we're, as Uluru Dialogues, we're running sessions, community engagement sessions, to inform and educate. We're technically not a part of the Yes Alliance or campaign. We're kind of our own entity because we don't want to force the vote onto anyone. We want you to come along the journey and understand what we're trying to achieve and then make your informed and conscious decision. And I think lastly, you know, as Bronwyn said, this is a gift to the Australian people to walk with us for a better future. And we're 3% of the population, then we need 97% to walk with us to ensure that we can have a voice and a say in the matters that affect us within our communities. You know, our communities are the experts, our community leaders are the experts, and we need to make sure that they have a say. And for young people too, we're on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook, so please get on it. We just had a Hands on Heart, our National Youth Conference, where we invited over 80 non-Indigenous and some of our First Nations youth ambassadors to Sydney over the weekend. And that was really powerful because that means that, you know, we have some, you know, we've felt really reinvigorated and refreshed. Because you see the same old politicians going at it, and it's like, this is not for the politicians, this is for the Australian people. This is a people's movement, and we need those genuine conversations, and that's how we're going to win. We're going to win by going to communities and talking at these sessions as well. So please get on board. We'll be doing information sessions throughout the next 6 weeks. It's going to be great. No, it's going to be awesome.
No sleep.
Yeah, mostly, but
Yeah,
thank
no
you.
sleep. Simon, do you have a closing statement for us?
Thanks, Odette. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great opportunity, just thinking big picture, and it's something I've thought about nothing as much as this in my whole career probably. And one thing I've thought about is my role as a non-Indigenous man, albeit one that's worked in the area for long. And for me, it was a matter of once I'd read everything and ascertained that there were really no legal risks in this proposition, including no legal risk to the future aspirations of our First Nations communities, the answer became a very simple one for me. I'm not in the business of telling First Nations friends and colleagues what they want and what they need. We've been doing that wrong for 200 years. I'm in the business of listening to what they want. And as Bronwyn said, we could quibble over the stats, and Emerson said, but there is no doubt that there is a very strong majority of Indigenous support for this proposal. At the end of the day, that's good enough for me, and I love the idea of a love letter, because for me, what I'm seeing as a non-Indigenous man is it's a hand held out from my First Nations communities and colleagues and friends. A hand held out that's basically, it's not an opt-out, it's not a demand for the keys to the truck, it's saying, let's promise to work together from now on. And for me as a lawyer, living with the responsibility of Australian history, in the shadow of that Australian history, what an incredibly wise and generous and optimistic gesture. And I'm going to be taking that hand with both of mine, and I'm going to be grateful for the chance, and I'm going to be committed to making it work. And at the end of the day, my 30 years of lawyering, government law and First Nations law and policy, every year of that tells me this is the right idea for the right time. The evidence is in, we know. No more times to mess around, let's get it in place. Our children will walk taller. And then I guess as I walk up to the ballot box, the other thing that will be in my mind, let's think about the bigger thing we're protecting here. Because we share our campus and our towns and our cities and our country with the living custodians of the longest enduring culture in human history, 65,000 plus, probably many more years. The most successful and enduring legal system, the most successful and enduring land management system. And my work with communities every day tells me that these are cultures of beauty, integrity and resilience. And I, for one, want to hear what this voice has to say.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. Simon and I were emailing and texting each other at 4 o'clock tomorrow morning, getting the questions all sorted. So we're both a little bit tired. Emerson, I'd like to throw it over to you for your closing statement as well.
Man, hard act to follow, hey.
I know, right?
I just want to sort of, reiterate what, all the other panellists have said as well. The Uluru Statement from the Heart is an invitation. We are 3% of the population, and this is something that the majority of us, 87% of First Nations peoples need. But we cannot do it alone. I've committed to voting yes on polling day, and I hope you can commit to voting yes as well.
Thank you. Everybody here, online and in the room, I'm going to draw the panel discussion to a close now. I would like to thank our panel members for coming out today and speaking their words of wisdom and also of their generous experience. Professor Bronwyn Fredericks, everybody. I would also like to thank Alira Davis, who has worked tirelessly for years now as a young, amazing black woman who is so passionate about creating change in Australia for her demographic and for her generation. Alira, thank you so much for coming out today. You'll sleep for 6 months when it's finished. Simon, as a friend of mine, I want to say thank you so much for coming with us today on the journey and being on the journey with Mob for an incredibly long time and being so passionate about Indigenous, the state of play for us. Thank you so much for bringing your wisdom today to the conversation. I really appreciate it. And let's not try to email each other at 4 o'clock in the morning again. Simon, thank you. And to Emerson, thanks. Favourite PhD student. Emerson, I just want to say thank you for not only stepping up and speaking your truth as a young Indigenous man about what this actually means to you, who's really passionate about this, playing in the space, is committed to it, and being such a strong voice for us here at UniSQ. It's actually really treasured. Thank you very much. Now, as Bronwyn told me before, one last thing we are doing, everyone was given raffle tickets, is that right? Grab out your tickets, people. I have got some gifts here. Is there a box or something? Oh, right, okay. I get to pick? Oh, okay. We're going to take 3 out.
So I'm going to tell you what the prize is, because we've got to have an event like this with lucky door prizes, right? So there's 3 prizes, and one is the quarterly essay by Professor Megan Davis, and the other one is Everything You Need to Know About the Voice, which is by George Williams and Megan Davis as well. So it's got all the answers there about the process and what the voice is about. And there's three of these prizes. C31. C31. Hey, your provost. Professor Karen Nielsen. How can we have 2? It's blue. Sorry, I will say blue. Blue? I'm terribly sorry. Oh, dear. Karen's very generously going to give it to Sue. Isn't that sweet? Karen can buy her own, I think. Oh, Karen has got her own. That's fantastic. That's even better. C Blue 17. Yay! Fantastic. Fantastic. Blue, number 6. C Blue 6. So one of the early people. Thank you.
Everybody, in closing, I'd like to ask everyone if they would like to join us for a light lunch that is offered up the back of the room. Thank you all for coming today and sharing the experience with us, and travel safe.